Pizar, visiting professor of law at Harvard Law School, a senior research scholar at Yale Law School, and a distinguished visiting jurist at the University of Toronto Law School. She has led an extraordinary life. Rosie was born in a displaced persons camp in Stuttgart, Germany in 1946. She arrived in Canada from a devastated Europe in 1950, and she has dedicated her life to human rights and the pursuit of justice. To name a few of her contributions, she served as chair and author of the Ontario Study of Access to Legal Services by the Disabled in 1983. She was the sole commissioner of the 1964 Federal Royal Commission on Equality in Employment, and the theories of equality and discrimination that she developed in that report were adopted by the Supreme Court of Canada in its first decision dealing with equality rights under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms in 1989. We are a better society for all of the firsts that Rosie represents. She was the youngest judge appointed in Canadian history. She was the first judge to preside in court while pregnant. She was the first Jewish woman on Canada's Supreme Court, which she joined in 2004. She was the first refugee sitting on its bench. And there she authored numerous landmark decisions, including as regards international law. Her efforts have been duly recognized around the world. She was elected to the Royal Society of Canada in 1997, to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2007, to the American Philosophical Society in 2018. In 2020, she was awarded the Knights Commander's Cross of the Order of Merit by the President of Germany. She holds not one, not two, not three, but 41 honorary degrees. And she has been the recipient of many other awards, including our own Goler T. Butcher Medal in 2018 for her contribution to human rights. These are devastating times for our world. I am so grateful that Justice Rosalie Abella can be here to address us at this time. Rosie, thank you for all you've done. Thank you for being here with us in person. It is such an honor for me to welcome you to give our assembly address. Thank you. Don't worry about
that. Thank you. Thank you, Gregory, for this wonderful chance to be here at the ASIL annual meeting. I have many friends in this room and a couple of heroes. Harold Coe, I think, is here. Alan Kessel from Canada. But mostly I'm here because I am so proud of what you've done as president of ASIL. I've watched as you've promoted the role of international law, the compassion of international law, the fairness of international law, and I've marveled at your commitment to ensuring that law and justice never leave each other's side as they patrol the universe. And I revel in how you do it with warmth, optimism, and generosity. And besides, you're married to the magnificent Michelle Goodwin, whom I want to be when I grow up. So I know this is the end of your term, and I've heard how hard you've worked. So in the spirit of generosity that you've promoted, I'm going to embarrass you by asking everyone here to rise and give you a standing ovation for all you've done to serve and enhance this organization. Greg has asked me to speak to you about the extensive contributions of the American Supreme Court to international law. Thank you. So rude, you're a visitor. I grew up thinking that international law was the most important law there was. I took for granted that the majestic world order we had created after World War II would be protected by international law, and I assumed that everyone else accepted its transcendental importance in protecting a global human rights consensus. And then I grew up, and now I think it's more important than ever. Because the more the moral vision and consensus we codified and ratified after 1945 was eroded by expedience and exhaustion, the more it seemed to me that we needed to recommit to the legal principles that animated the Copernican legal revolution in the aftermath of World War II. More and more, I think justice, including international justice, is in crisis because more and more people have decided that, like the Red Queen in Alice in Wonderland, the law is what they say it is. There is seemingly no more consensus about what justice means, or what democracy means, or even what the law is for. We are in a moment. I think we have to acknowledge that this is not by any stretch the best of all possible worlds. We're at the edge of a future unlike any I've seen in my lifetime. The extremes have occupied the middle, and the middle is polluted by bombastic and demagogic incivility from the extremes. Everyone is talking, and no one is listening except in their own ideological silos. It's a moral quagmire, a moral free-for-all, and a moral vacuum. We're rolling back hard-fought human rights for minorities, immigrants, refugees, workers, and women. We're in a world now where too often law and justice are in a dysfunctional relationship, and a world where prejudice poisons and hate kills. Too many governments have interfered with the independence of their media and judges. Too many people are strident. Too many people have been killed. Too many people are poor. Too many children are hungry. And too many people have lost hope. We're forgetting our compassion and making the vulnerable more vulnerable in a world that was supposed to have learned the horrendous cost of discrimination after the Second World War, so that being different would no longer expose someone to danger. How did we get there? The truth is, we let it happen by tolerating the intolerable for far too long, sacrificing principle for political pragmatism, substituting political accountability with moral lassitude, and replacing moral clarity with moral laissez-faire. Ultimately, I think we just gave up. Who are we to say whether democracy is better, we said? Who are we to impose human rights on those who eschew them? Who are we to insist on due process, an independent bench and bar, protection for women and minorities, a free press, freedom of expression or religion? We somehow became persuaded that humility and respect for differences required us to accept the legitimacy of regimes which did not share our views about democracy, human rights, or justice. We ignored the moral legacies of World War II. We were wrong. We may have had the rule of law, but did we have the rule of justice? We need a just rule of law, not just the rule of law. Laws and rules are important, but of what value are they if they drift or stagnate in a sea of non-compliance? So let's go back to the beginning, to the origin of the species we call modern international human rights law. not only to understand what we evolved from, but also to understand what we've evolved into. Human rights in our lifetime cannot be understood without understanding their conceptual proximity to the Holocaust. The world was supposed to have learned 3 indelible lessons from the concentration camps of Europe. 1, indifference's injustice's incubator. 2, it's not just what you stand for, it's what you stand up for. And 3, we must never forget how the world looks to those who are vulnerable. The Genocide Convention and its spiritual sibling, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, whose 75th anniversaries we celebrated last year, were the wings of the phoenix that rose from the ashes of Auschwitz and roared its outrage. They were the powerful legal symbols of a world shamefully chastened. They were united by the institutional rebuke represented by the creation of the United Nations. And what lifted the phoenix and gave it power to fly was the momentum it got from the trials at Nuremberg, which started almost 80 years ago and bore witness to Holocaust atrocities and roared at the greatest injustice of the 20th century. Elie Wiesel said, "Nuremberg is the story of those who did the killing. Nuremberg is also the story of those who did nothing," quote. It's quite a story about inhumanity, about immorality, about indifference. A story with many lessons to teach. But the past 80 years have shown how few of them the world has wanted to learn. For me, those lessons are not just theory. 200,000 European Jews survived the Holocaust. 3 of them were my parents and grandmother. My parents got married in Poland on September the 3rd, 1939, the day the war officially started. My mother's family manufactured roofing materials. My father graduated with a master's degree in law from the Jagiellonian University Law School in Krakow. He was scheduled to take his examination to qualify as a judge in Radom in October 1939. Instead, my parents spent almost 4 years in concentration camps. Their 2.5-year-old son, my brother, and my father's parents and 3 younger brothers were all killed at Treblinka. After the war, my parents went to Germany, where the Americans hired my father, who had taught himself English, to help set up the system of legal services for displaced persons in the Allied zone in Southwest Germany. In an act that seems to me to be almost incomprehensible in its breathtaking optimism, my parents and thousands of other survivors transcended the inhumanity they'd experienced and decided to have more children. I think it was a way to fix their hearts and prove to themselves and the world that their spirits were not broken. My formative years were spent in the shadow of the Nuremberg trials. I was born, as you heard, in a displaced persons camp in Stuttgart, Germany in July 1946, the month the prosecution summed up its case against the major war criminals trial. And we came to Canada in 1950 with my parents and sister and grandmother a few months after the Nuremberg trials ended. I was born at the beginning of Nuremberg, was surrounded by the survivors for whom it was created, was nurtured by parents who had somehow escaped the final Nazi verdict, and watched a father try to create a system of justice for people who didn't know such a thing could exist in Germany for Jews, all before I was 4 years old. I grew up with a passion for justice, but I have also, now that I am grown up, developed a sadness for what has become of it despite Nuremberg. Lawyers like me, I think, have a tendency to take some comfort, properly so, in the possibility of subsequent judicial reckoning, such as occurred at Nuremberg. But is subsequent justice really an adequate substitute for justice? I don't want for a moment to suggest that the Nuremberg trials weren't important. Of course they were. They were a crucial and heroic attempt to hold the unimaginably guilty to judicial account, and they showed the world the banality of evil and the evil of indifference. But although Nuremberg represented a sincere commitment to justice, it was a commitment all too fleeting. Not for long did the prosecution of war crimes remain a magnetic national preoccupation for the Western Allies who created it in the intimidating shadow of the Holocaust. By 1948, Britain issued a communique to the Commonwealth countries putting an end to the attempt to prosecute Nazi war crimes as a response to recent tripartite talks about political developments in Germany. We are convinced, the British communique said, that it is now necessary to dispose of the past. The crisis in Berlin, with Russia thereby, turned Germany from an enemy to be restrained into a prospective ally to be recruited. By 1949, it was all over. No more Nuremberg trials, no more Nazi war crimes prosecutions anywhere in the Western world for over 2 decades, and the early release of many convicted war criminals who'd been sentenced at Nuremberg. The past was tucked away, and the moral comfort of the Nuremberg trials gave way to the amoral expedient of the Cold War. Worse, as the passion for justice faded into passion for reconstruction, the world once again lost its compass and yielded to the seductive temptations of intolerance. Even before the decade was over, the decade that had seen the Holocaust and the Nuremberg trials, Nazis were being welcomed in the West as immigrants to help design the military-industrial strategy against the new villain, communism. The Jewish victims of the old villain, fascism, on the other hand, were welcomed nowhere. In addition, Senator Joseph McCarthy revived the odor of anti-Semitism in the United States. In my own country, Canada, universities had quotas on Jewish students. Courts upheld restrictive covenants preventing Jews from buying property. There were signs on beaches that said no Jews or dogs allowed. And as the powerful book None is Too Many searingly described, Canada closed its borders to Jewish refugees like me for years after the war. With stunning alacrity, the world abandoned what proved to be its momentary pursuit of tolerance at Nuremberg and reconstituted itself within 5 years, as if neither Nuremberg nor the Holocaust had ever happened. It was a collective form of repressed memory. I never asked my parents if they took comfort from the Nuremberg trials, which were going on for 4 of the 5 years we were in Germany, until we finally got permission to come to Canada in 1950. I have no idea if they got any consolation from the conviction of dozens of the worst offenders. But of this, I'm sure. They would have preferred by far that the sense of outrage that inspired the Allies to establish the military tribunal of Nuremberg had been aroused many years earlier, before the events that led to the Nuremberg Tribunal ever took place. They would have preferred, I'm sure, that world reaction to the 1933 Reichstag fire decree suspending whole portions of the Weimar Constitution, to the expulsion of Jewish lawyers and judges from their professions that same year, to the 1935 Nuremberg laws prohibiting social contact with Jews, or to the brutal rampage of Kristallnacht in 1938, they would have preferred that world reaction to any one of these events, let alone all of them, would have been, at the very least, public censure. But there was no such world reaction. By the time World War II officially started on the day my parents got married, it was too late. For me, Nuremberg represents the failure of decent, well-meaning Western democratic nations to respond when they should have and could have to a virulent, horrifying strain of anti-Semitism in Germany in the 30s. Millions of lives were lost because no one was sufficiently offended by the systematic destruction of every conceivable right for Jews that they felt the need for any form of response. And so the vitriolic language and venal rights abuses, unrestrained by anyone's conscience anywhere, in or out of Germany, turned into the ultimate rights abuse, genocide. Some justice did in fact emerge in the aftermath of Nuremberg, and there are many connective dots of history leading to the presence of which we can be proud. We've made remarkable progress, and we're immeasurably ahead of where we were in many, many ways. But we still have not learned the most important lesson of all, to try to prevent the abuses in the first place. We have not finished connecting history's dots. Decades later, we still have not developed an international moral culture which will not tolerate intolerance. The gap between the values the international community articulates and the values it enforces is so wide that any country that wants to can push its abuses through it. No national abuser seems to worry whether there'll be a Nuremberg-type trial later, because usually there isn't. And in any event, by the time there is, all the damage that was sought to be done has been done. We have to recognize that the human rights abuses we've been tolerating in some parts of the world are putting the rest of the world in danger, because intolerance, the world's fastest growth industry, seeks in its hegemonic solipsism to impose its intolerant truth on others. Yet over the years, we've been incredibly reluctant as a global community to hold the intolerant countries who abuse their citizens to account, and instead seem to go out of our way to justify their abuse with an explanatory lexicon that included terms like cultural relativism, domestic sovereignty, root causes, or the most recent one, settler colonialism. But in what universe can you ever justify rape or torture or hostage taking? To paraphrase Martin Luther King, the arc of the moral universe may be long, but it decidedly does not always bend towards justice. And that means that too many children will never get to grow up, period, let alone grow up in a moral universe that bends towards justice and the just rule of law. I used to see the arc of my own life bending assertively from Nuremberg to ever-widening spheres of justice. But in this unrelenting climate of hate, I feel the hopeful arc is turning into a menacing circle. We need to stop yelling at each other and start listening so that we can reclaim ownership of the compassionate, liberal, democratic values we fought World War II to protect, and to put humanity back in charge by replacing global hate with global hope. When I was younger, I thought the answer was the UN. The UN's charter said that the peoples of the United Nations determined to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women, and of nations large and small. The UN had 4 objectives: to protect future generations from war, to guard human rights, to foster universal justice, and to promote social progress. Its assigned responsibility was to establish norms of international behavior. It was our generation's designated trajectory, and it was to be the inspiration for the world's conscience. We made a commitment to humanity then, that we would protect the world from inhumanity. Since then, over 40 million people have died as a result of conflicts all over the world. I know the UN is all we have, but does that mean it's the best we can do? Nations debate, people die. Nations dissemble, people die. Nations defy, people die. We need more than the rhetorical splendor of the laws of justice. We need justice. I make these observations not because I have any particular solutions to propose, because I don't, but because I want to hear a serious conversation among people more expert than me, people who care deeply about the moral choices we make as a global community, about how to fix a status quo in which some of the worst criticisms are directed at Western democracies, what I would call low-hanging fruit, while the worst abusers barely glance over their shoulders, too busy doing now whatever they want to do to their own citizens to care about history's judgment later. There's no doubt that many of the UN's agencies have achieved enormous success in a number of areas, and we should be extremely grateful to them. But the UN was the institution the world set up to implement never again. Its historical tutor was the Holocaust, yet it seems hardly to be an eager pupil. What was never supposed to happen again has, again and again. The judgment at Nuremberg was an encomium to justice. Almost 80 years later, the judgment after Nuremberg is a lament. In my view, the global legal community needs to rethink the morality of its almost reflexively protective attitude towards this institutional behemoth, stop making excuses for its inexcusable and seemingly infinite patience for injustice, and start insisting that it do the job it was set up to do. And that brings me back to my parents. You cannot be born in the shadow of the Holocaust to two Jews who survived it without an exaggerated commitment to the pursuit of justice. You cannot grow up indifferent to a just rule of law when every adult you love experienced the horror of its subversion. And you cannot live a life without idealism when the very fact of your birth reflects a tenacious belief by parents whose only son had been one of the war's 6 million martyrs to injustice, without the belief that the world would turn fairer. My father died a month before I finished law school, but not before he had taught me that democracies and their laws represent the best possibility of justice. A few years ago, my mother gave me some of my father's papers from Germany that I'd never seen before. And in those papers, I saw why he always spoke so respectfully and appreciatively of Americans. The letters were from American lawyers, prosecutors, and judges he worked with in the US zone in Stuttgart. They were warm, compassionate, and encouraging, either recommending, appointing, or qualifying my father for various legal roles in the court system the Americans had set up in Germany after the war. These people not only restored him, they gave him back his belief that justice was possible. One of the most powerful documents I've found was written by my father when he was head of our displaced persons camp in Stuttgart, where we lived. It was his introduction of Eleanor Roosevelt when she came to visit our DP camp in 1948. He said, "We welcome you, Mrs. Roosevelt, as the representative of a great nation whose victorious army liberated the remnants of European Jewry from death and so highly contributed to their moral and physical rehabilitation. We shall never forget that aid rendered by both the American people and army. We are not in a position of showing you many assets. The best we are able to produce are these few children. They alone are our fortune and our sole hope for the future. As one of those children, I am here to tell you that the gift of justice is the gift that just keeps right on giving. A gift that took me on a journey from a displaced persons camp in Stuttgart, Germany, all the way to becoming the first Jewish woman on the Supreme Court of Canada. My life started in a country where there had been no democracy, no rights, no justice. It created an unquenchable thirst in me for all three. It also instilled a passionate belief that those of us lucky enough to be alive and free have a particular duty to our children to do everything possible to make the world safer for them than it was for their grandparents, so that all children, regardless of race, religion, or gender, can wear their identities with pride, in dignity, and in peace. That is what international law is for. And that is why I think international law is the most important law there is. And because you are the lawyers who turn international law into hope for humanity, you are the most important lawyers there are. So thank you on behalf of the future generations of children you're giving hope to. And thank you, Gregory, for giving me the privilege of speaking to your extraordinary colleagues in ASIL. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosie, for those powerful, moving remarks that call us all to the sufferings of those who came before us and the task that lies before us. In a few moments, I'm going to pass the gavel to our president-elect, Melida Hodson. But first, I'd like to share a few brief last announcements to you. First of all, this year marks the 20th anniversary of the establishment of the Arthur C. Helton Fellowships,